everybody. Welcome to this GC3 webinar entitled The Role of Policy in Green Chemistry Research and Adoption. I'm Saskia from Bergen, GC3 Education Project Lead. This webinar is part of a series through the GC3 Education Group, and the series is being designed to be a webinar-based green chemistry and safer alternatives training curriculum for GC3 members and other companies. For this webinar, we're excited to present Joel Tickner and Robert Giraud. Joel is both the director of GC3 and an associate professor from the Environmental Health at University of UMASS Lowell, and Robert is a principal consultant in environmental engineering at DuPont. They'll be providing an overview of the range of policies that affect chemical design and product development and adoption, and outline how policy affects research and developing at major chemical manufacturers. And with that, let's get started. Joel?
Good morning. Thank you very much, Saskia, and welcome to the webinar today. So what I'm going to do is give a broader overview of the role of policy in green chemistry. And it's interesting, years ago I taught a class with Amy Cannon, the director of Beyond Benign and the first PhD in green chemistry. We taught a class for green chemists about policy, and the green chemists asked, well, what does policy have to do with what we do? And by the end of the class, I think they walked away understanding that, well, actually there is an important role of policy in accelerating green chemistry. And policy has various roles, and we'll talk about both public and private policy, but it plays a role in shaping chemicals and materials choices, in supporting research, development, and adoption of green chemistry, providing incentives and disincentives to move away from or towards certain types of chemistries. And what we do understand about policy in this day and age of global policy development, state, local, federal, international, is that policy sometimes can be a challenge for designers and for EH&S people in firms, and poorly designed policies can potentially serve as barriers to green chemistry, but at the same time, well-designed policies can support and advance innovation. So let's start with what we mean by policy. And policy is a broad term, and this is a very nice definition from the US CDC. It's a law, regulation, procedure, administrative action, incentive or voluntary practice of governments and other institutions. And what's important here is that policy decisions are not just about policy, but they're reflected in resource allocation. So resource allocation says something about the policy of an organization or institution. So let's take a big 30,000-foot view of what policy is. And policy can start with broad statements, goals, and principles. It can be strategic plans that outline the direction of a particular agency or organization, and those might be energy policy or sustainability policy, or in Europe there are non-toxic environment policies, but all of those set in course a series of actions to move towards implementing those plans. Guidance is a form of policy. Laws and mandates and requirements are the typical thing we think about when we think about policy. We think about it as restriction and disincentive versus incentive. But incentives and awards are a type of policy. Information, disclosure, transparency is a type of policy. Education can be informed by policy or driven by policy. And then lastly, as I said before, budgets and budget allocation is a form of policy as well. So we might put this into some broad categories. There's private policy versus public policy. So private would be at the individual firm level, and Robert Giraud is going to talk about that later on. Public policy is government policy. We often think about policy as carrots versus sticks. So carrots are incentives-based policies. Sticks are more regulatory, mandate-oriented policies that discourage a type of behavior. So we also have, at the government level, there's regulatory policy versus discretionary policy. So government agencies have bully pulpits, and discretionary policies come out of that voluntary nature. What we see often is that agencies tend to focus because their resources and their reporting or requirements to Congress are based on their implementation of regulatory mandates versus discretionary programs. So when there's budget crises, discretionary programs often tend to see cuts versus regulatory programs which are mandated by Congress. So traditional types of policies, chemists are not unaware of policy. They see policy all the time, or designers. They see design standards. So those might be ASTM or NFPA type standards like flammability standards or safety standards. Those are very commonplace for designers and chemists, as well as performance standards like failure rates or mil specs if you're in an aerospace type firm, or material properties standards. And designers and chemists tend to be very familiar with single chemical restrictions like those under RoHS or the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act. But we might think about health, safety, environment not only as a regulatory standard or policy standard, but also as design standards. So those get integrated into chemical and material design. So let's start with private policy. So there are various types of private policy, ranging from corporate goals and metrics that might be passed along a supply chain, like you need to comply with these goals. They might be internal metrics. So for example, Interface Carpets had its Vision Zero or its Mission Zero, which was a series of policy goals for the company to have zero impact on the planet. And they developed metrics on how they were getting towards those goals. There may be requirements that a company has for the use of particular standards, tools, or certifications. So for example, only Green Seal certified products will be purchased, or certain tools like the green screen must be used to assess chemicals. There might be disclosure requirements. Those are becoming much more commonplace in certain sectors. The electronics sector, the footwear and apparel sector, the auto sectors have long had disclosure requirements through the IMDb database. There's restricted substances list and chemical restrictions that firms have. They may have chemical testing programs for products they manufacture or source. There may be incentives that certain companies give for preferable purchasing or certain organizations. And then lastly, there are curriculum and education standards that are a form of private policy that then influences, for example, education around engineering or chemistry. If we're talking about government policy, we can take that at multiple levels, and this is where complexity can be a challenge for companies. We have the international level policies. Those are then ratified into national policy, so conventions like the Montreal Protocol or the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. There may be regional conventions or policies between nations, for example, between the US and Canada, like the Boundary Waters Treaty or the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. There may be national policies. Obviously, TSCA is a national policy, or regional policy like REACH in Europe. There are state policies, for example, the California Prop 65. There are local policies. For example, San Francisco has numerous policies around chemicals, and other states and localities are passing chemical disclosure or restriction policies. And again, it's all about this complexity, which can be challenging in a global supply chain. So let's talk for a minute about what types of government regulatory policy options you might see. Clearly, there are standards such as pre-manufacturer or pre-market requirements. There are exposure levels, for example, in the occupational safety and health context. There are permits for water or air. And then there are also performance standards where a certain level of performance must be achieved, for example, in a specific technology. There are chemical restrictions. There are laws that require chemical assessment or some kind of risk assessment or safety assessment. There are laws that require testing, and then there are laws that require information disclosure, whether on toxicity, ingredients, emissions, or they require some kind of planning for pollution prevention. Several state policies require toxics reduction or pollution prevention planning. Just to give you an idea, on the chemical side, there are a number of laws that affect and regulate chemicals in products and manufacturing. If it's in a pharmaceutical product or a medical device, that's the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, or cosmetics or food additives, food contact articles would all be the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, which is implemented by the Food and Drug Administration. Toys would generally be, and other consumer articles, by the Consumer Product Safety Commission under the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act. Other types of products and processes would be the Toxic Substances Control Act and pesticides by FIFRA. Nanomaterials depends on their application, and then workplace exposures would be the Occupational Safety and Health Act. What this says is that, the use of the chemical will affect what law it's regulated under and then what implementing agency there is. So from the regulatory policies, we get into discretionary policies, and there's a number of types of discretionary policies that agencies may implement. And those would be purchasing or procurement policy. There's a federal executive order on sustainability purchasing that then trickles down into individual agencies and their purchasing or procurement policies. Several states and local governments have purchasing or procurement policies that integrate consideration of safer chemistry. There are support and recognition programs like the EPA's Presidential Green Chemistry Awards, or a recognition program or labeling program like the EPA's Safer Choice labeling program. There are economic policies such as technical support or liability as under CERCLA, financing policies which may come from agencies like the Department of Commerce or the Department of Agriculture. There are tax incentives and subsidies that may come from various agencies. Agencies also issue guidance documents that may give guidance on how to address a particular chemical risk or exposure or product development. There are loan and grant programs such as the SBIR type grants. There are R&D support programs such as the SUSCHEM program at NSF, which was established under the America Competes Act. There are innovation programs such as the National Manufacturing Initiative program that came out of the White House. And then there's obviously education policy. Again, what's important here is all of these are affected by budget and resource allocation. So those impact particularly more discretionary policies than regulatory policies. States and localities, as we know, are moving beyond the federal government in many contexts, has implications for businesses. We know over history states have usually been the innovators in environmental policy, that environmental policy, and this is similar in Europe, that environmental policy innovations tend to happen at the state or the member state level and trickle up to the national level. What we've seen in chemicals regulation at the state level is chemicals restrictions on single chemicals like mercury broadening out into broader information and substitution-based policies. We've seen the leadership in this at the state level has been states like Maine and Michigan, California, Washington, Massachusetts, New York, Minnesota, and Oregon, and then some local initiatives in San Francisco and Seattle. Several states have built green chemistry support programs, Michigan, Oregon, Washington, Minnesota, as Saskia is quite involved in Northwest Green Chemistry, which is a regional green chemistry support initiative. What we're seeing is also greater interstate collaboration through what's called the Interstate Clearinghouse on Chemicals. This is a database that my group developed several years ago that now is run by the Interstate Clearinghouse, where you can search individual policies that have been either proposed, enacted, or failed at the state level based on a number of criteria and product types. It's an excellent resource to understand what is happening at the state level. So there's a question here that we ask in policy analysis is, great, it's on the books. Well, does it actually work? You know, that's what we call policy evaluation and policy analysis. So we do have very good evidence over history that well-designed policies can support innovation, but much of our effort around policy has been focused on the demand side. So it's been addressing chemicals of concern or addressing chemical information, but not as much attention to the design phase. And so what we've seen is that the supply side of green chemistry policy to support that has been limited, and hence in some ways green chemistry really hasn't achieved the mainstream yet. Again, policy analysis is key here in understanding what works, what doesn't work. Typically in the policy cycle you see broad agenda setting leading to policy. That implementation really matters, and then we assess policy and then start and revise that policy based on our assessments. But what's really important here and often left out in much of the discussion about policy is implementation. What can we learn about implementation? A well-written, strong policy on the books doesn't mean that it will actually be successful in its implementation. And there are a number of factors that weigh in the implementation phase of a policy. It's not just the legislative language, but that legislative language then gets translated into policy or guidance or regulation at the agency level, and that agency then is, in its development of regulations, is bound by other types of policies, for example, small business support policies or executive orders that may require consideration of costs and benefits of policy. So policy takes time, and if budgets also affect that. So, a typical policy may take from legislation to development of standards or regulation at the agency level to actual implementation may take many years, depending on these various other factors, for example, White House review or judicial review that may have to occur. We did a report or an article several years ago that tried to put that in context of this evolving debate over TSCA reform, that just getting language in TSCA won't resolve the issues of implementation, which have to deal with resources, political context, the procedures that an agency has to go through to actually implement a law. All of those matter when we look at policy overall. So if we're designing policies to support green chemistry innovation, what do we want those to look like? So Nick Ashford at MIT has written a lot about the drivers of innovation in policy. And you might think of three core elements here. Willingness, and policy or regulation often creates willingness, or market demands create willingness, but you need willingness as a first step. But with that willingness, you also need capacity. And that capacity is important, particularly for small and medium-sized firms that may not have the technical resources or the support or education necessary to implement a policy. And then lastly, you need opportunity. You need to create those opportunities to innovate as well. And that may come from education or tax incentives or grants. But all of those become part of an important package of developing policy. So policy should be thought about as a package, not as an individual piece of legislation. So let me give you one example of a policy that has been quite successful is the Massachusetts Toxics Use Reduction Act. So the act, which was passed in 1989, set up goals and definitions for toxics use reduction. It requires that manufacturing firms that manufacture, process, or otherwise use a list of about 600 chemicals, characterize and report on their chemical use every year. So it establishes metrics so you can understand why and how a chemical is being used and look at progress in toxics reduction. It requires those firms to also conduct a planning exercise to evaluate alternatives. It doesn't require them to implement them, but it requires them to look at the cost of the alternatives and the full cost of using a particular priority chemical or chemical on the toxics use reduction list. But secondarily to that, firms pay a small fee that funds technical assistance, research and education support, demonstration and partnership that helps support that capacity and opportunity for innovation. So those three elements of willingness created by the chemical information requirements as well as the planning requirements combined with opportunity and capacity help lead to that policy being successful in the end. GC3 has developed a guide with the National Pollution Prevention Roundtable to help support green chemistry efforts, policy development at the state level through information development and dissemination, economic incentives, recognition programs, and regulation and policy tools. And then lastly, at the federal level, Senator Coons from Delaware, DuPont's home state, has introduced a bill called the Sustainable Chemistry Research and Development Act. It was reintroduced in May. And that bill sets up a series of programs to accelerate sustainable chemistry. The other policy that's important in this space is the America Competes Act, which established a SUSCHEM program at the National Science Foundation. These are some of the core elements of the Sustainable Chemistry Research and Development Act, providing support for sustainable chemistry research, development, demonstration, technology transfer, commercialization, education, and training, methods for federal government to create incentives for sustainable chemistry, expanding education and training, collecting and disseminating information, supporting venues for outreach and dissemination, and developing metrics. So all part of that package of support. This is discretionary in many ways, but incentivizing sustainable chemistry. The GC3 is about to put out its agenda for mainstreaming green chemistry, and part of that agenda is really about supporting smart policies, including the Sustainable Chemistry R&D Act. So that agenda will come out later this summer and help present the GC3's vision of a package of policies and activities that will help mainstream green chemistry. So with that, let me stop and thank you very much.
Thank you, Joel. Next we have Robert.
Thank you, Joel and Saskia. My presentation is on the role of policy in advancing green chemistry innovation with a focus on corporate policy. An overview of the presentation is shown in a pyramid form with the values at the base of the pyramid. For values form the foundation for a company, and policy translates those values into business systems, and those business systems are needed to develop and market more sustainable products. We will address each of these four in turn. First, values. The foundation of DuPont is our core values. These values are the bedrock for everything we do and set the tone for how we operate our businesses around the globe. First, safety and health. We share a personal and professional commitment to protecting the safety and health of our employees, our contractors, our customers, and the people of the communities in which we operate. Environmental stewardship. We find science-enabled sustainable solutions for our customers, always managing our businesses to protect the environment and preserve the Earth's natural resources both for today and for generations into the future. Respect for people. We treat our employees and all of our partners with professionalism, dignity, and respect, fostering an environment where people can contribute, innovate, and excel. Highest ethical behavior. We conduct ourselves and our business affairs in accordance with the highest ethical standards and in compliance with all applicable laws, striving always to be a respected corporate citizen worldwide. Next, our purpose. DuPont is a science company. We work collaboratively to find sustainable, innovative, market-driven solutions to solve some of the world's biggest challenges, making lives better, safer, and healthier for people everywhere. Our mission is sustainable growth. Sustainability is at the core of what we do, from reducing our operational footprint and creating market-facing sustainable solutions to addressing the global challenges of the future. Our sustainability efforts create shareholder and societal value while reducing our environmental footprint along the value chains in which we operate. We are committed to inclusive innovation with suppliers, customers, governments, academic institutions, and others. Next, let's look at policy. We define policy as a set of principles that directs current and future business decisions and activities to carry out core values and behaviors held critical to the company. The DuPont Commitment is a commitment to all of our stakeholders that we will conduct our businesses with respect and care for the environment. We will continuously analyze and improve our practices, processes, and products to reduce their risk and impact throughout their product life cycle. We will develop new products and processes that have increasing margins of safety for both human health and the environment. Compliance with this commitment and applicable laws is the responsibility of every employee and contractor acting on our behalf and a condition of their employment or contract. We will deploy our resources, including research, development, and capital, to meet this commitment, and will do so in a manner that strengthens our businesses. We also have a supplier code of conduct whereby suppliers will provide DuPont with high-quality products and services that meet all applicable quality and safety standards. Suppliers will need to demonstrate that they have quality management systems in place. Suppliers will comply with all laws and regulations and will implement measures to protect any trade secrets provided during the course of our business transactions. And suppliers are expected to embrace responsible care or develop similar programs to support their own operations. We adhere to the responsible care guiding principles, and there are a lot of them, so I'm just going to highlight a few. First, similar to what I just mentioned in the commitment, design and develop products that can be manufactured, transported, used, and disposed of or recycled safely. To work with customers, carriers, suppliers, distributors, and contractors to foster the safe and secure use, transport, and disposal of chemicals, and provide hazard and risk information that can be accessed and applied in their operations and products. To design and operate our facilities in a safe and secure and environmentally sound manner. To promote pollution prevention, minimization of waste, and conservation of energy and other critical resources at every stage of the life cycle of our products, and to support education and research on the health, safety, and environmental effects and security of our products and our processes. Product safety management requires an understanding of intended uses, a science-based assessment of potential risks from products, and consideration of opportunities to manage product safety along the value chain. To that end, we have adopted the Responsible Care Product Safety Code as a policy. I will discuss our product stewardship management system later in the presentation. Public policy also plays a role. As the graphic points out, sound science informs public policy. The Long Range Research Initiative does research to address gaps between new technologies and the science to interpret and understand the emerging data. Key questions include what research is needed to bridge the gap, how to harness the data to better inform decisions about public health, and how best to communicate research outcomes as they evolve, and continual feedback loop between the research activity and policymakers to facilitate informed public health decisions. An example of good public policy is the Montreal Protocol that Joel mentioned earlier. The Montreal Protocol is a public policy that facilitated the development and evolution of a regulatory structure that spurred innovation. It's been called the most successful multilateral environmental agreement in history because it's grounded in science, it aligned the goals of governments, industry, and non-government organizations. It developed an innovative regulatory structure that combined flexibility with regulatory certainty, enabling governments to adapt to their own circumstances. And it recognized HCFCs as an interim solution, providing confidence in the market for environmentally superior products. And of course, it made special provisions for developing countries. The success of the Montreal Protocol shows that international cooperation among all stakeholders with flexible regulations designed to stimulate innovation can lead to rapid progress toward protection of the global environment. A related public policy example is the recent EU MAC Directive, which promulgated the European Commission's HFC regulations. It has a predictable regulatory scheme with a realistic timeline. The 2006 Directive on Mobile Air Conditioning Systems, MACS, aims at reducing emissions of greenhouse gases which contribute to global warming. The EC MAC Directive allows only refrigerants with a global warming potential less than 150 in new type vehicle models sold in the EU countries beginning January 1, 2011, and in all new vehicles as of 2017. We'll talk more about this in a product example later. Okay, next we'll talk about systems. Sustainable growth is built on strong stewardship. As you can see, the foundation here, and from a product sustainability standpoint, is product regulatory, then where we focus on meeting, of course, the regulatory requirements. Then we step up from that to meeting the needs of our customers and supply chain partners through product stewardship, and build on that toward product sustainability, where our key stakeholders are people and planet. And there's a parallel build up for environmental regulatory, environmental stewardship, and process sustainability as well. Let's look further at product stewardship. First, product stewardship along the value chain is defined as the shared responsibility for identification, management, and communication of product health, safety, and environmental information and issues along the entire value chain in a way that adds value and meets customer, market, societal, and stakeholder expectations throughout the product life cycle in support of our company's right to operate, innovate, and compete. In the company, we operate under a product stewardship management system. The elements of the system are 1, policy and leadership, 2, planning, 3, implementation, 4, performance measurement, and 5, management review. As you can see from our Global Reporting Initiative report that shows the life cycle stages in which health and safety impact of our products are assessed for improvement, we do so across all phases of a product life cycle. Collaboration with customers and supply chain partners is key to success in both product stewardship and in innovation. An example of collaboration with customers and supply chain partners was the development of the chemical management module with the Outdoor Industry Association and the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. Mark Rossi of Clean Production Action was a key partner in putting this together. The goal of the chemical management module was to identify and drive improvements within an organization and supply chain towards sustainable chemistry, and it focuses on the important notion that success requires collaboration across the entire supply chain, a systematic approach. I mentioned innovation a moment ago, and here we try to graphically show the DuPont Innovation Platform, where we combine global market insights with science and technical capabilities to deliver solutions across the range of product offerings the company provides. Another way that we have a system in place to promote development of sustainable products and meeting customer needs is through our sustainability goals. In 2006, for the first time, when we announced the 2015 sustainable goals, and for the first time we went beyond reducing the environmental footprint of our operations to focus on serving the marketplace to develop and make commitments toward developing environmentally smart opportunities from our R&D efforts, revenues from non-depletable resources, and products that protect people, as well as products that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I should point out that these goals from 2006 were due to be complete by 2015. DuPont met these goals by 2013. A new set of goals is due out from the company later this year. As we look forward, it's important to think about current and future trends in sustainability. Current trends are already impacting and shaping our businesses' markets today, such as product transparency and sustainability, resource efficiency, climate change, and supply chain resilience. But there are also accelerating trends in terms of water availability and quality, climate change adaptation, zero waste, and a circular economy that deals with a product end of life. And there's an expectation that companies integrate sustainability into corporate strategy and growth plans. To make progress in addressing sustainability, DuPont uses green chemistry and green engineering. And green chemistry uses a set of 12 design principles that seeks to maximize efficiency and minimize health and environmental impacts throughout all stages of a chemical's life cycle. We take a holistic approach to putting the 12 principles into practice and consider ourselves a leader in the industrial application of the 12 principles of green chemistry. To make progress in developing products that make use of these approaches, we take a disciplined approach to R&D product management using a stage gate process. The dollar signs show the increasing dollar commitment as we move from ideation to concept evaluation, candidate optimization, prototype testing, the customer qualification, and launch. And we do our best to generate as much knowledge as early as possible while options are still open and costs to make a change are relatively low back in the ideation and concepts evaluation phase, because our basic approach is fail fast, succeed early. And through a disciplined but flexible stage gate process, we know we can achieve our objectives. As part of that, we promote proactive product stewardship during product development. In the concept phase, we develop where ideas are developed and a business merit is evaluated. We also determine whether the product is in need of initiating a product stewardship process, and where it is, we get basic property, regulatory, and public perception data about the chemicals, including evaluation of its persistence, potential for persistence, bioaccumulation, and toxicity. In the evaluation and planning phase, where we refine the product and its definition, we also look at the inventory status of the product and examine export control, potential export control issues, identify applications and end uses, and start to build a product stewardship review team and explore gaps in toxicological and environmental fate data. And as we progress through the phases, we add the appropriate additional considerations around environmental and product stewardship to assure that by the time we're at the commercialization phase, we've assured that we are indeed ready for launch, and we set ourselves up for success on a going forward basis through periodic product stewardship reviews of the product in the market. And the net outcome of these processes, that these business systems, are our products. Our science accelerates discovery, inventions, and growth. When DuPont science meets the demands of the global market, the result is innovation. Over the past several years, we've had increasing revenue from new products, whereby DuPont has shown to have a record of sustainable innovation is by the great increase in patents granted annually and patent filings and the number of new products commercialized. Some examples of these new products are shown on this slide, and I'd like to highlight a couple. First, BioPDO, propane diol via biological route. BioPDO research began in 1994, and after 12 years of steady progress in research, development, and demonstration, the manufacturing facility started up in about 2006. This bio-based route to PDO uses 40% less energy than the incumbent chemical route did. Besides use in Sirona for carpet, textiles, and such applications, PDO is also a building block for other renewably sourced products. Those of you that have seen me talk at the Green Chemistry Conference also know that I I'd like to talk about Rynaxypyr, a new class of chemistry in crop protection where there's minimal impact to non-target species and low environmental impact and lower use rates. Companion, more recent crop offering is Cyazypyr with similar attributes. And an example related to the Montreal Protocol and the EU MAC Directive we spoke of earlier is the development of Opteon 1234YF. Going back from the Montreal Protocol initial discussions over 25 years ago going forward, you can see a steady progress through collaboration, innovation, and commercialization where we shifted from CFCs with high ozone depletion potential and high global warming potential to HCFCs with low ozone depletion potential but high global warming potential to HFCs with no ozone depletion potential but still with high global warming potential, and now to HFOs with no ozone depletion potential and very low global warming potential. It's through working with the regulatory agencies, engaging our stakeholders, that we've been able to innovate proprietary new products and commercialize them into the market. And specifically, Opteon YF is our offering in Europe to meet the EU Mobile Air Conditioning Directive, where it has a global warming potential of 4, far lower than the 150 requirement of the EU MAC Directive and far lower than the incumbent that it displaced by a couple orders of magnitude. And it's effectively a drop-in replacement for current refrigerants, which is no small task, and it would save 600 million gallons of fuel per year through its use. Now, in order to deliver on these innovations over time, it's important to protect CBI, confidential business information. The ability to protect legitimate confidential business information and prevent piracy of intellectual property is critical to competitiveness and innovation. There is active industrial espionage seeking to steal trade secrets that needs to be recognized, or if we simply give innovation away, there is little reason to innovate. And wrapping up, I'd like to sum up a view of how we can promote development of safer, more sustainable products. We do so by focusing on meeting customer needs, something we call inclusive innovation, through multidisciplinary, well-integrated teams, through a holistic approach to reducing environmental footprint along the value chain, through disciplined R&D project management that integrates green chemistry and product stewardship from the start, also using exposure-based tiered approach to hazard data collection and implementation of 21st century approaches to hazard identification and risk assessment. We have some ongoing needs. It's important to have a stable, predictable regulatory environment for products and processes, a science-based approach to risk management where risk is a function of hazard and exposure. It's important to have engagement of the industrial innovators in the development of new regulations, and strong protection of confidential business information. We also look to government support for development of transformational technologies and partner with academia and government labs on technology development, and look to government for facilitation of pilot scale and demonstration facilities to overcome the issues of scale and incumbency for new technologies. And we continue to look for collaboration partners to assure improvement in research tools with better predictive capabilities, and are looking for further promotion of global regulatory acceptance for validated new in vitro assays, and development of adverse outcome pathway AOP libraries toward more mechanistically based quantitative structural activity relationships, QSARs, because we realize together we can accomplish what no one can do alone. I'd like to thank my colleagues that helped put the presentation together and taught me most of what I have talked about, and I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. We have a first question. So this one's for Robert. How does the Opteon YF save so much fuel each year? Can you expand a little bit on that, please?
To the best of my recollection, there's something about the compression ratio of the refrigerant that allows it to be more efficient. When you think about, well, those of you that are old as I am, you think about the days when you run your car with the air conditioner on versus the air conditioner off, and the change in fuel economy in terms of back in the days, particularly when we had 3 on 11 as a car refrigerant. I think it has something to do with that the way that this particular refrigerant is designed and the new mobile air conditioning units with it allows for more efficient operation.
Thank you. Another question is, you mentioned you do the fail-fast approach when you develop new products. Could you expand a bit more on the assessment of environmental impacts, in particular persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic?
Oh, okay. So in using the Pro 3, which we call promoting proactive product stewardship, early on in back at the concept phase where I said we get property, regulatory, and public perception data about chemicals, let me show you how we do that. So we use something we call METIS, a chemical screening tool, and this is an example of the visualization part of the screening tool. So for a given compound, we have a system in place that is basically a database of databases and uses visualization technique to pull all the information together to make it easy for the chemists and the product stewards to review the compound they're looking at working with. And so information through models and available literature data is in there for persistence in air, water, and soil. We also have information on potential to migrate to groundwater via soil mobility. We have bioconcentration factor and bioaccumulation factor information, as well as information on Daphne-efficient algae aquatic toxicity, and also look at carcinogenicity, reproductive toxicity, and mutagenicity of the compound. So as part of that initial look at compounds that are used in a new route, we do this evaluation that includes this look at PBT-ness.
Okay, thanks. Another broader question. What are the benefits of restrictive policies for innovation?
So I think where restrictive policies can be beneficial is helping to take that last sort of leap towards innovation, or that last sort of push. We think about, for example, some of the work in lead-free electronics here in the United States. You know, we've heard from some firms in the electronics space that they had been looking at lead-free and had struggled with it, had not found options that worked well in a cost-effective way, and that it was ultimately the passage of RoHS restrictions in Europe that forced them to have to take that last little push to the finish line to make those technologies work. So I think in some ways it helps give that last push towards action. So there is a whole literature out there that restrictive policies can support and push innovation to happen where it may not. The other area where restrictive policies can be helpful is that voluntary policies, incentive-based policies, tend to be very good to incentivize leaders and not laggards. So they're good for the firms that really have an innovation mentality that want to move forward, but the firm that doesn't necessarily want to move forward is not going to easily be incentivized by an economic benefit, et cetera. The one sort of caution in all of this is where restrictive policies that are not linked to some kind of valuation of alternatives could lead to regrettable substitution, where the goal is avoidance rather than finding better alternatives. And what's interesting in the ozone depleting substances context, in the context of the Clean Air Act implementation of the Montreal Protocol, is the EPA's SNAP program, which requires a review of alternatives to ozone depleting substances through the New Chemicals Program. So that has that sort of fit to it. So those would be my sort of answer and caution.
I generally agree with what Joel said. I'd like to also add that what's important in public policy is that there's a good science basis and that there's a good implementation scheme. So, and part of the implementation scheme is to evaluate alternatives, as Joel pointed out, but another part of the implementation scheme is that there often needs to be time to make the desired change.
Okay, thank you. One more question for you, Robert. What's the risk at DuPont that parts of your company will try to get around your policies for their own advancement? I
think the risk is pretty darn low. This commitment that I have on the screen now that I talked about earlier is something that's been signed on by all of management and is a condition for all employees. And this pretty well sets the tone for how we do what we do, and that operationalizes our core values largely around environmental stewardship. So that I think is probably most germane to what's the questioner is asking about. So I'm proud to work for a company that is organized the way we are.
Great, thank you. Any other comments from Joel or Robert?
Excellent overview from Robert of how a large corporation looks at policy and the value of policy and what it would like to see. So I think as we move forward in thinking about policies to incentivize green chemistry, I think there's a lot to be learned here in developing a smart portfolio.
Great, thank you. Thank you everyone for your attendance, and we hope to see you soon. And thank you both, Joel and Robert.
Thank you, Saskia.